And I'm firstly going to introduce one of our student interns, Muireann Corcráin. Muireann is a Trinity College Dublin master's student in speech and language processing with an undergraduate degree in history and modern Irish. She is a fluent Irish speaker, a Gaeilgeoir, and held the position of Gna Gaeilge, or Irish Language Officer, with Trinity College Dublin Students' Union last year. She's a youth representative with the National GAA Youth Committee, and she joined the NStEP team as a student associate for 6 months back in September 2020 to lead a new project on equality, diversity and inclusion in student engagement. So over to Muireann to tell us all about her project.
Muireann, Kevin, and thank you so much for having me today and for letting me, I suppose, give a bit of insight into the project that I undertook, the direction we took with it, and just kind of the thoughts of what's going to happen in the future. So I have my lovely little presentation here. Let's see if this works. Fabulous. Okay. Now, again, as Cam was kind of saying, you would think that after a full year of being online that I would actually have a handle on this, but we'll see how we go. Okay, so as Kevin said, I came on board with NStEP in September as associate intern and taking charge of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion project. And my background would be around Irish language activism and looking at, you know, that accessibility of making Irish accessible for everybody. But I also learned so much during my time in the student movement and in the Students' Union, particularly from the other officers, and learning about, you know, how we can engage with each other to ensure that whatever we undertake within our own roles, that we're able to incorporate other people's ideas into our discussions as well. And so when I came onto this project, I wasn't really 100% sure which direction I wanted to go. So I'll discuss that throughout the presentation. But I knew that with this project that it would hopefully aid to create a more inclusive environment within HEIs, and to understand and to recognise that engaging with your diverse student cohort, your diverse staff cohort, and being inclusive of everyone's opinions can really help to drive that forward. So let's, why is this not moving? Ah, found it down the bottom. Again, I should know how to do this by now, but anyway. So in terms of an overview of what kind of happened throughout the project, we were very conscious of trying to engage with EDI initiatives that are already underway within the higher education sector, particularly with work that is being done within HEA and the like. So I have a big list there of people that I engage with from USI, from INAR, the Irish Network for Anti-Racism, HEA, TIA, the IOA, the DCU Centre of Excellence, with the lovely Sandra Healy and Emma Lou in particular, who were fantastic in giving guidance and advice about projects that they're undertaking and how we can bring a student voice into that. I have Sparks there as well, because we had a fantastic chat with Megan Brown, who gave really good insight into how we can engage with our diverse student community and the Irish Centre for Diversity. So the big thing that we were kind of trying to figure out was, well, what can we bring out of this project? Or is it going to be a simple resource? Is it going to be a report? Is it going to be guidance? Is it going to be a framework? And we kind of just hit on the fact that with NStEP, you've got the introductory class rep training. And one of the key things that came from the 2019 consultation was that everybody wanted to talk about diversity, but didn't necessarily know what diversity meant or how you could bring that into the student engagement sphere. And they also looked for additional training and training opportunities for class representatives. So I decided we'd kind of try and marry the two and give class reps that initiative of learning about the different definitions and how they can bring that into their class representative role. So we decided we would look at designing this pilot diversity training, which our NStEP student trainer team facilitated so fantastically. It was absolutely brilliant. We had our institutional and open sessions, as stated earlier, with 90 participants. So huge thank you to IADT and UCC, who facilitated the institutional sessions. And 97% of those participants recommended the training, which on a personal level, I felt quite overwhelmed to think that something so small that I had created was making an impact. But on a national level, it really shows that students want to get engaged in these conversations and to recognize that they have a role to play in these conversations, even if they think initially that they don't, because you know, they don't have an issue with accessibility, or they might not come from an ethnic minority background, but that they recognize from this that everybody has a role to play. And there is going to be a natural, in the next academic year, once all the feedback has been taken on board and the program has been tailored. So as I said there, it offers the students the opportunity to learn about these really important concepts, such as universal design for learning, recognizing discrimination, unconscious bias, and offering them tools and support to bring about that change at their local level as well. So as I said, these were kind of the key questions that we had, because we wanted to ensure that whatever NStEP was taking on within this project, that it was aligning with the work that was already happening within the sector. We didn't want to deviate too much, but we also wanted to make sure that students were at the forefront. And that was one of the things that we recognized a lot within the higher education sector, that a lot of this stuff is very much staff orientated in terms of anti-racism in the workplace, and every single piece of that work is so crucial and so important, but a lot of the time it's the student voice is kind of put on as an add-on, not really at the center or at the focus. So that was the big thing we wanted from this project, that students were at the focus and that staff could be aware of the fact that this training was going to be implemented. We looked at the supports that were currently available within students' unions. As I said, we wanted to ensure that we were aligning with EDI initiatives in the sector. And then it was that big question of, well, how are we going to do this? Is it going to be that booklet, or is it going to be a simple report, the training, or the online module? So we've just, we decided we would focus on pilot training and get a sense of where students were at with the concepts of EDI, and ensuring that we can build in the future. I didn't want it to be finite, because as it's kind of been said before, anything within this area, it's that journey, it's that changing path. It's never going to be, we've done this project, we're going to close the book. I wanted to ensure that whatever would happen with this project would lead on to bigger things. In 5 years' time, this training might not be suitable. So at least we have that framework now and the structure of the training, that it can be altered to reflect what the students want in terms of EDI. And I love this quote, and I have it in training, so Cam and Ryan will recognise this quote: "Diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance." And I think it's really important to recognise that the idea that you're looking at this representing diversity training is that by doing this training, you're learning not only to recognise the diversity, but you're also recognising how you can be more inclusive. And this is a concept that works with both staff and students. If you show staff what you can do, and if staff show what they can do within making content accessible, they're being inclusive of that diverse cohort of students that they have. And the training itself has various tools and resources that shows this, and all our resources are up on the student portal as well, that Jeffrey has developed. And as I've said, it gives you that initiative to learn about representing diverse classmates, but also empowering them. And that's kind of a domino effect, I guess, that you can be that person who can bring that student in who may not necessarily be engaged because they don't feel like they have that voice. You're giving them that voice through your role as a class representative. And who knows, that they could take on the initiative to run for class rep the following year, or to get involved in students' union initiatives and movements. So by you empowering your fellow classmates, you're changing the face of the student movement. And that's a really cool concept to think about. So I have the 4 aims there as well, to recognise the diverse peer group, using those tools, resources and concepts over the wide variety of topics, identifying and expressing the importance of that diversity, and representing your classmates and your peers. I think one thing that's really important with this training, and I will kind of pop onto the next slide just to kind of give an idea of it. These are some of the topics that we discussed. And when we were initially designing the training, and Oisin will attest to this, we were very, I suppose, we weren't really sure what way to structure it for quite a while, because EDI is such a broad concept and there's so many different paths you could take, and what we decided was, instead of specifically focusing in on topics such as anti-racism or discrimination, by looking at these concepts in that kind of broad sense, that you can apply that unconscious bias into any aspect of EDI, that you can look at that intersectionality aspect, which ties it all together, or even the concept of UDL. I've never heard of UDL before this year, and so many student reps came back and said they'd never heard of it, but it makes so much sense, especially with the times that we're living in. And it gives those, it kind of gives that overview and those tools and resources that you can delve into any area of EDI and start to educate yourself and learn about how these tools can impact in so many different areas. So I just had the slide up there for the UDL aspect, and I know for a fact that so many people have gotten in touch and said they're engaging with UDL and that their staff and lecturers are getting involved in UDL as well, which is amazing to see. So to finish up, because you've had enough of time spent listening to me, future development of the training resource will include that feedback from participants, and it will also be brought into the national rollout, which for me is incredibly exciting, because that means we're going to be, engaging with more students, aside from the 90 who participated in the in pilot sessions. It's just so cool to think that so many students are going to be able to engage with this, and that it can be developed further in the future. There's scope for the development of online modules. So if students were looking to have the online modules like we have up with on the student portal at the moment, and they wanted to engage with one about UDL, there's an area that we can get involved with the likes of AHEAD and USI and have that all kind of collated together. Continue student engagement and involvement in EDI development and NStEP. I'm even delighted today to see the student partnership being the new framework up on the website with videos and clips and recordings. That's that accessibility element. You're catering to so many different people who may not necessarily like looking at lots of words, but that they now have that audio recording. So that's fantastic. Ensuring the strong student partnerships within EDI and giving the recognition that everybody has a role to play. Students can be an amazing driving force for change, and staff being receptive to that is huge. The biggest thing that I can think of at the moment is within Trinity that there was a petition launched to have a Black Studies module included in our extracurricular modules, and that's going to be implemented in the coming academic year. And that came from students who wanted change and who wanted to broaden their mindset and educate themselves about issues like this. So by facilitating that student and engaging with students on that partnership level, that's the type of change you can see. And we all know this, but it's such a cool thing to see actually happening. And again, to kind of finish up, it's that element, that kind of concept that diversity and inclusion really go hand in hand. You're not going to be inclusive if you're not engaging with your and staff cohorts. You're not going to be inclusive just by having someone there at that table. You need to ensure that they're partaking in conversations. It's avoiding that tokenistic element and ensuring that they're being brought on the journey, but that they're also conducting the journey with you and making those efforts for change. So that's me for the moment. I will stop sharing now and I will hand you back to Kevin.
Muireann, a huge thank you to Muireann for that really interesting presentation. We're going to have some time hopefully for questions towards the end after Naomi has presented. And that brings me swiftly on to introducing Naomi. Naomi Algeo is an occupational therapist by background, having completed her undergraduate degree in 2014 at NUI Galway. She moved to London in 2015 to work clinically, and while there she received a National Institute for Health Research pre-doctoral fellowship to complete a postgraduate taught master's in clinical research at City University of London. She's now completing her PhD in occupational therapy at Trinity College Dublin and has been involved in student engagement for a number of years, winning the City University of London Programme Representation Award in 2017 and joining NStEP as a Student Quality Assurance Reviewer in January 2020. She also sits on the project team that created the new framework, and she led the recent NStEP project as Student Associate for Postgraduate Student Engagement. So I'm going to pass over to Naomi to tell you a little bit more.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. My name is Naomi Algeo. My internet dropped 10 minutes ago, so I might look a bit frazzled, but I'm back. So I will very briefly, I'm conscious of time, but I'll try and get through our recent postgraduate report. So you can see here the postgraduate student engagement in decision making, fostering connected learning communities, and that recently came out last month. So I'm sure there will be a link in the chat box at some stage. So I'll give you a little bit of background. I joined as a student associate intern with Muireann at around the same time. It was kind of around the end of August, September, and the project topic I suppose I was given was postgraduate student engagement, but there was no predefined idea of what exactly that was. So I suppose the first 2 months of the project was very much a scoping process. So looking at the literature, having very kind of informal meetings with the sector. And it became very clear, I suppose, that there really wasn't very much out there, and here's our report. In terms of the published outcome, we have the report here, and just to explain, it does have a number of case studies as well threaded throughout it. So we were trying to get something practical, but I suppose in terms of how it came about, following the scoping review, it was very clear that there were a lack of resources for postgraduates in general. So particularly for postgraduate research cohorts. So, I think Cameron had mentioned before, that postgrads seem to be this hidden group, and absolutely that was completely echoed. So postgrad taught and research, but in particular, postgrad researchers. There were also difficulties, I suppose, we found in supporting postgrad reps within the student voice structures. It wasn't quite as clear cut or defined there. And there was very much a lack of specific focus across national, not just Ireland, but internationally, on postgrads and student partnership. So there have been previous calls for NStEP to develop some kind of training specifically for postgrads. And I know that there is some postgrad taught training at the moment. But we don't have anything specific on postgrad researchers, and part of that is we don't have a foundation. We need to lay the foundations before we can build on those blocks there. So we needed a baseline, and hence this is the work that we did. So I suppose what we did was between December and February of this year, we hosted 15 discussion forums online, and that represented 17 higher education institutions in Ireland. So I think we had 6 universities, 2 technological universities, 6 institutes of technology, and 3 private institutions. So we had just over 50 postgrad researchers and taught students involved, and we had 28 higher education institution staff consulted. So we had 4 themes. And I'm going to very briefly touch on each. So the 4 themes were building community, encouraging involvement, the feedback loop, and moving forward. So very briefly on theme 1, building community. I suppose what became very obvious was that throughout all the forums, building community and a sense of connection within the institution was of great importance. So we also, I suppose, found that there was a need for consistent and accessible induction processes too. So at the very onset of somebody starting their postgraduate program, do they feel a sense of belonging, I suppose? And it was interesting because some people wanted to build that community first before getting involved in student engagement processes, whereas others actually, their motivation for getting involved in student engagement roles was actually to build the community. So community was quite a strong theme that emerged initially. The next piece was encouraging involvement. So why do postgrads get involved, or why do they not get involved? So we know that postgrads have a very unique, I suppose, demographic compared to undergraduates. So typically they're a little bit older. Typically they might be juggling other roles, whether that's caregiving roles, employment roles, things like that. And they might be more likely to be completing their studies part-time. So there was very much a sense that, time was one of the biggest factors. So they needed to prioritize and look at competing pressures. And I suppose really what was interesting is a postgraduate was more, I suppose, enticed to get involved in these type of processes if they could see that there was a greater purpose or value to them. So whether that is that they would develop, you know, leadership skills, or that they would get a better knowledge of I suppose, higher education processes. There was sometimes an apprehension to raise a student voice and be the face of that feedback, I suppose. But also, there was a piece around the awareness of opportunities, you know, and particularly now as we've gone online the past year, a lot of the comms would be through email. So thinking creatively outside the box of how do we promote the seat at the table. And finally, on this theme, that identity within the learning community. So, you know, I think somebody mentioned before about it's a bit of a blurred role. You're not quite a student, not quite a staff member, yet you often share some of those shared responsibilities between the two. The feedback loop. So this theme looked at, you know, really wanting feedback to be authentic and not just a tick box approach. There was a piece, really important emphasis on closing the loop and providing, you know, that transparency. So I suppose, you know, a clear finding was for the variety of feedback mechanisms, as well as that marked value on the transparency and feedback. So really being clear, you know, this is what we could do, or if we couldn't do something, this is why. People felt a lot more motivated if their institution was transparent in previous feedback. And finally, moving forward, what next? So I suppose there were 5 really nice key considerations that came out here in what we can consider. And what I should mention is throughout the report, there are threaded considerations for good practice on each of the themes that you can consider. But under this theme, number 1, that we look at a training now or in the future for postgraduate researchers to take up roles. And there will be some aspects of this report that can help inform that, although we're not quite there yet. Number 2, enhancing postgrad representation structures, so making that much more clear. Number 3, developing a national networking network, I suppose, for postgraduate student engagement for staff. And this was identified by staff, which was quite interesting. It wasn't something that we had considered. Number 4, recognition and rewards for staff and students. So what's in it for me? And I think, you know, people were talking earlier on this morning about how do we get buy-in? So whether that's through CPD or some type of digital badge, there were a few examples given in the report. And finally, flexibility. So for postgraduates, so the continued use of maybe, you know, online or a hybrid system in the future that will help postgraduates who mightn't be in a position to attend every meeting due to those time constraints we were talking about, to consider that in the future. So thank you very much. And I know that myself and Muireann would be very happy to take any questions on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for all the work that you completed with that project. And it's great to hear from both of you about your experiences of the project and what you feel it means going forward for student engagement practice. And maybe picking up on that, I might ask my first question, and I'll go first to Muireann. Both Muireann and Naomi, both of yourselves have been involved in leading really significant areas of work for NStEP, and it really embodied the spirit of partnership, the fact that they were student-led projects. So I was just interested in your reflections on some of the challenges, but also the opportunities of student-led projects within higher education.
Oh, that's a fabulous question. You always hit us with the hard-hitting ones, don't you, Kevin? I think the big thing, especially with this training program for me, was because it's for the students, it needs to be led by the students. I think it is imperative that staff are obviously aware of the training, that they know what the training is about. But what I found a lot was training like this is, you know, it's there for staff in the form of unconscious bias training and things like that, but not necessarily directed at students. So that was one of the kind of the big factors for me, was that whatever is kind of there, we need to make sure that students have that level footing. So students are the ones that are going to be leading these projects or taking the lead on certain aspects of projects. They bring in a really valuable mindset and outlook on where the future is going to be. And I think that's a really, really important thing to consider, that, you know, that you always hear it from your family or friends, oh, you're the future of this country or the world, and you need to kind of give those students that voice now so that's implemented in the future.
Thanks, Muireann. And the same question to yourself, Naomi, the challenges and opportunities of student-led projects within higher education.
Yeah, I suppose, and I'm lucky because I got a minute to reflect. I think for me, I was reflecting, I'm in the final year of my PhD, and obviously I was working on the student-led project. And for me, one of the challenges is juggling time, but then how to overcome that, I suppose, was I was very lucky to have been offered a lot of flexibility. So it wasn't always, you know, I have to do these hours on these particular days. There was a lot of, you know, flexible work in there. So, and, you know, that came through in our I suppose, our report for postgrads, that time was one of the issues, and postgrads just really need flexibility. So I suppose the challenge is that time pressure, but the potential solution is giving that platform of flexibility in working hours as well, definitely.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to go for one final question. And although both of you had quite distinctive projects, and both of your projects, I think, spoke really well to that whole idea of inclusivity of student engagement and reaching out to cohorts who perhaps aren't always heard as readily within the higher education environment. So maybe just your thoughts around how going forward we can ensure that we're more inclusive in our approaches to student engagement and partnership. And I'm going to start with Naomi this time and then go to Muireann.
I think something that came through on the report for postgrads was that how do we promote awareness? And I don't think you can include people if they don't know in the first place. So for example, there was a lovely quote, I think, in the report that, you know, there was a postgrad I was talking to who didn't see the opportunity to get into a rep role because I think it was, the email was part of a canteen update or something. And it was later, weeks later, that they realized that, oh, okay. So I think really, yeah, really looking at how do we promote these opportunities, because we can't include everyone if we're not, you know, if people aren't informed in the first place.
Great, thank you, Naomi. And same question to yourself, Muireann, around inclusivity of student engagement practice going forward.
Yeah, I suppose leading on from what Naomi has kind of said, if you're kind of thinking in that kind of student movement mindset, I suppose, where a lot of my background would be, that if you don't, it's that kind of concept. I'm going to steal a quote from the 20 by 20 Women in Sport campaign. If you can't see it, you can't be it. And it's that visibility element that is really crucial. You have students who may come from an access background or who might come from an ethnic minority background, but if they don't see someone up there promoting their thoughts and what their experience is like, it's very hard for someone to want to get involved or to see that opportunity for them to be involved. And I think one particular initiative that has been amazing is something that has been done by USI, the Women Lead, which has been developed by USI. And you see that now where we've had 2 female USI presidents in a row, with Claire Ostick coming in, and in Trinity College the year before, where we had 5 female sabbatical officers, because women were shown that you have a space here. So now it's about kind of bringing that forward and using that visibility for everybody, and the concept of the framework can be communicated in such a way that students can feel like, oh, I actually have a space in this domain or this principle. And if staff kind of recognize that as well, you're starting to break down that barrier. You're starting to break down that barrier of not having that visibility, and that's what's going to ensure that student movement, student engagement and student partnership will become more diverse and more inclusive in the future.
A great point, thanks, Muireann. And I've used that exact same quote around you cannot be, you cannot see quite recently in the same context. So Thank you so much. A huge thank you to Naomi and to Muireann for really, really insightful presentations, and also for incredible work that's been completed across the duration of their student internships with NStEP. We're